Good evening and welcome to Studio 12. I'm your host, Tamara Banks. The United States has always been a place of diversity and religious freedom. However, since 9/11, Muslim Americans have been subjected to some unfair scrutiny. Whether it be about immigration or racial profiling, the issue lingers in our communities. Tonight, we'll discuss what it's like to be a Muslim American in a post-9/11 world. We have an amazing panel with us tonight, so please welcome them to the show. First, Imam Abraham Kazerouni is an Iraqi native who leads the Abrahamic Initiative, a program of interfaith dialogue between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Rima Barakat is an American Palestinian, a frequent speaker, and an active member of the Denver Muslim community. She is a board member of various interfaith organizations, including the Abrahamic Initiative of St. John's, among others. Welcome. Zahir Ahmad is an Arab American who was born in Jordan and has been living and working in the U.S. for 17 years. As a computer programmer, he has worked for IBM on computer programmer on IBM and government contracts, pioneering Arabic text-to-speech software. And Sawa Ramadan is a Palestinian Lebanese who was born and raised in the United States. She is very active in the Denver Muslim community. She currently works as a social worker in child protection. We'd also like to invite you at home to join us in our conversation by dialing 303-296-1253, or you can just email us at studio12@kbdi.org. So let's get started with one of the most important questions. I know that 9/11 impacted all of us in some way or form. In what way did 9/11 change your worlds? Imam, let's start with you, sir.
I think before I talk about specific case, my own, one needs to put this into perspective. On September the 12th, the administration decided to take a new approach, which they call a preventative approach. And the consequence of that preventative approach was that, from my own experience as I have traveled around, the biggest racial profile taking place in this country since the Second World War against Muslims and whoever looks like or looked like Muslims.
Right.
Over 90,000 people were called in one way or the other, and they were targeted, either FBI interviews, special registration. I was called in to go and register as well. So not only that, it created an environment in which all the prejudices as well as racial dislike of the Muslims came to the surface and found a justification. Specifically, I would like to concentrate, as a consequence of 9/11, not only Muslims felt that their faith has been hijacked, their country, because they have lived in here, and as a citizen, their country was attacked. They felt that their allegiance to the country was questioned. Mm-hmm. And consequent to this kind of behavior was that, particularly, in my case, the State Department's ruling that anybody who supported Islamic Center, any religious organization, should be targeted for specific investigation. That resulted in a number of what I call liberal religious institutions going down the drain, because people simply did not want to have the headache of IRS or anybody else investigating them for sending $50 or $100 to the local Islamic Center. And this itself had kind of the result was a blowback in which liberally oriented Islamic centers became very weak financially and created an environment where the extremists, with huge financial support from outside, particularly from Saudi Arabia, to be able to influence these centers. It was disaster. In terms of number of Islamic centers.
So it was a disaster for the community that was really the center point, the focal point where you would go for worship, for socialization, for socializing rather, for being
Yes.
together as a community.
Yeah.
Rima, explain your experiences.
Personally, the impact on me, I kind of second what Imam Ibrahim had just said. We, as a woman who, I consider myself to be not too strict, but I have my faith, my Islam, but to feel basically cornered and stereotyped on the outside, but then again would feel this rightist, quote-unquote rightist trends within some of the Islamic institution just get unfold, just basically take control. And so you feel sometimes uncomfortable on the outside, but then again on the inside it's got actually worse.
On the inside?
In some of the Muslim institutions.
Oh, I see. So here your impressions, and how has your life changed?
Oh, quite a bit. I think one of the things I always look at when I reflect on 9/11 and how it affected us is what life was like before 9/11 and what it turned into after 9/11. I came to the United States in 1990. I was 17 years old. And so I practically grew up here. And I must say I lived my life fairly innocently. I just went about my business, went about my studies, went about my work, and enjoyed or tried to enjoy life to the fullest. And after 9/11, things have dramatically changed. I had felt that I cannot be as innocent as I was before anymore. And I'll give you a simple example. In fact, a month after 9/11, I went to Circuit City to shop at a computer store to shop. And I asked them if they had a shortwave radio, because I'm a listener of the BBC, have been since I was 6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
The clerk didn't know what a shortwave radio was, and he phoned the police because he thought I was shopping for spying equipment. It would have never occurred to me before. But, I realized that since 9/11, everything that you do, innocent as it may be, is going to be looked at and is likely to be interpreted in a way that is unfavorable to you. Unfortunately, I will also second what Rima and Imam Ibrahim said. I think the communities in general have been affected. I think one of the important things to keep in mind here is that law enforcement has exercised its mandate incorrectly, unfortunately. I think that most Arab Americans, if not all Arab Americans, after 9/11 would have been absolutely happy and glad to help the government understand what is going on, to thwart any attempts, if there were any, to have a repeat of anything even remotely similar to 9/11. Regrettably, the way law enforcement dealt with this is by creating suspicion, by making everybody a suspect. And so I am sitting here, rather than wanting or being willing to cooperate with law enforcement, I'm actually sitting here defending myself, trying to convince them that I'm not involved with 9/11. And unfortunately, things have taken a turn to the worst afterwards. I think that there have been a lot of wasted opportunities where law enforcement could have created a very good and a very meaningful dialogue within the communities and with the communities that it has been targeting. And unfortunately, all that they did is they created suspicion. They made everybody suspect. And it really has resulted in a very difficult situation for all of us.
And so you're saying they could have used you as a resource to understand what was happening and get some more intelligence, if you will, and understanding about what the next steps might be.
Absolutely. I think one of the problems is that the FBI agents came in, and I speak from personal experience, they come in and they want to recruit you as a CI, as a confidential informant or as a spy. And, my whole point when I was approached was, wait a minute, let's open a dialogue with the community. Let us open a dialogue with the leaders of the community. You've got to understand that none of the people implicated in 9/11 were residents in this country. None of them were citizens of this country. This country has been a safe refuge for all of its existence to people from other parts of the world, whether they're Arabs, Irish, Germans, Jews. And people that come here typically are generally loyal to this country and want and are disposed to its happiness. So let's open a dialogue. But the idea was, no, we want to get confidential informants. And I wonder actually if that's not a result of them wanting to improve their careers on certain occasions, because the more CIs you have, the better you look to your bosses. So a lot of dynamics here at play, but I think there have been a lot of wasted opportunities, and there have been a lot of lives that have unnecessarily been impacted negatively as a result of things that really shouldn't have happened.
Right. Well, so let me ask you, is it any different or any easier for younger generations, younger people, the people around you, the 20-somethings, that they actually get it, that they're a little bit more open-minded, or is it the same experience that you've heard the others on the panel speak of?
I think for me, after 9/11, it was a rude awakening. I mean, we're a country that supposedly prides ourselves on we're a melting pot and we respect all these different cultures and people that come here. And, the biggest things that I would experience are people cursing at me or telling me to go back to my country, the automatic assumption that I wasn't born and raised in the United States, that I must have, come here at some point, or, people spitting on you, or one time I was driving my car and somebody tried to reverse their car on me while I was, driving. So it was very difficult to see that people are not open-minded by any means, and that they sort of just did this kind of blanket statement across the board on all Muslims, all Arabs. And do I think that people in their 20s are a little more open-minded? I think you have some open-minded regardless of the age span, and then you have the ones that just aren't. But I think that it was positive for me in the sense that it made me realize we as a community need to wake up. We've sort of sat back for years upon years and let people sort of build these stereotypes and build these racist stigmas against us, even if it was just in the media, TV, and it was kind of in good fun or in good nature. And so we'd sort of sit back and let them build us as the terrorists or things like that, and never really coming forward to try and put a stop to that. And so, of course, when something tragic like 9/11 happens, things that people have sort of been absorbing subconsciously kind of comes to the surface all of a sudden. And
right.
And so for me, it was very positive in the sense that I woke up a little bit and I started to really kind of challenge people on the way that they were thinking, and making it a point to go to schools and go to churches and go to conferences and whatever I could sort of get involved in to build those, to break down those stigmas and those barriers that were there.
And be part of the educational piece.
Right. And to say, you're free to have your opinion, but do it with some kind of a knowledge base,
right.
Research and meet what the average Muslim is like or the average Arab is like, and get a feel for who we are before you sort of make those assumptions.
Well, wasn't it last week or the week before where two Arab-looking men, is what they were described as, on a plane, and they were arrested because somebody on the flight said they were concerned that these two men were on the flight and they were speaking in Arabic, and it turned out that these gentlemen were actually training U.S. forces on on technology and such. So I want to ask you then, speaking of sort of looking over your shoulders 24/7 at the airport, is that one place where you're particularly sort of going, oh gosh, I really don't want to do this?
Well, before I answer the question regarding the airport, I would like to go back what Sister Selma said. When I was at the Islamic Center, a group of teenagers from local school came in and they said, we have heard about this reaction to the Muslim community, and we would like to go through to start a project. And these were girls around 13, 14, or 14, 15. Mm-hmm. So we had a long conversation, and they decided to go to Cherry Creek Mall between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock in the morning. Just walk through the mall with no cover, no head cover and everything, just as they were. Then came back to the Islamic Center and we organized head coverage for them, and then to go back and record exactly how people were treating them.
And they were not Muslim?
No, they were from the local high school.
Okay.
And the experience, what they wrote down and brought with them, was eye-opening for them. For the community, we knew exactly how we were treated. Immediately, I remember that day when I went to the Islamic Center, and for months we had threatening calls, we had all kinds of labels, and even today still when you go through the airport, you have to allow 2-3 hours or an hour or more than anybody else, because as soon as somebody looks at your name, Muhammad, you stay over there, or you come from outside, they look at your passport, 2-3 hours of research, going through everything that they have.
So you have to allot an extra 2 hours or so just to get through security. Yes. Let's talk a little bit about, do you think it would be easier if you were living in a European country versus American Muslim? Zahir?
I've traveled actually through Europe extensively, before and after 9/11. And I think, look, one of the things I really want to focus on here in this discussion is there is always going to be xenophobia. We're just now the wave or the community that's experiencing it. But, anyone who studied American history can see or can remember seeing the NINA, no Irish need apply, or no Jews are allowed to live here. Mm-hmm. That's part of the fabric, that's part of the way we react all over the world. I would not necessarily condemn Americans particularly, although I certainly would hold the society here to a higher standard, because we are a democratic country. We are a country that consists of immigrants, entirely almost. But what really concerns me, though, is that the fact that the laws are being changed, the fact that the profiling is making it into the law, is making it into the way the government conducts business. And this is really the red flag that needs to be raised and talked about, because people's opinions are going to change. I'm very optimistic. I think it was Winston Churchill that said, Americans always get it right, but not after they try everything else. So we'll get past that. But what scares me is when we have laws on the books that will remain and that will be used not only just against us, but against everyone that the government, may not particularly fancy later on. And I think that's happening in Europe as well as it is here. I've traveled in England. I must admit, there was a psychological factor about it. I actually went to England a month after 9/11. And I remember, because it was the second day after my computer store experience, and I was so relieved to land at Heathrow. It was like a big burden has been lifted off my back. But, I talk to people in England on a regular basis, and there have been all sorts of things that are similar. People are people. People will have stereotypes. People will have misconceptions. And it's our burden to educate them and work with them. I'm just concerned about the rules of the game changing.
Right. And on that point, talking about the civil liberties, at what point do you say we're doing this for the better of all, to protect everyone, versus stepping over into somebody's infringing on their rights to be able to wear, a scarf on their head and to be able to, dress any way that they would prefer, because that's who they are. And on that note, I'm just curious, what is it like to be a Muslim American woman in the United States? Do you think it's more difficult for a woman, particularly if you are wearing a scarf?
It's a good way to stand out.
Yeah. Is it difficult to keep your culture, the issues of modesty and the alcohol issues and dating and such?
Well, I do not cover usually, and except of course when I enter the mosque. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that, if anybody is bearing the brunt of all these converging circumstances, is the women who cover. Women like Salwa, and because they are the front, they're so visible, more than many. When they could be just stepping out of the door, and they're targets for any bigot or racist. As far as myself, it is not that hard. It hasn't been hard for me. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's been harder for me kind of trying to comply when I'm in the mosque rather outside. But I'm sure Salwa has a different experience.
Right, since you are in the front line there,
right.
With it's being so obvious.
Right. I mean, I think your ethics and values are something that are sacred to you, and so it's as easy as you allow it to be. So as far as when you talk about like the alcohol and things like that, I mean, that's never been an issue for me, because those are just things that I don't get involved with or that I don't deal with, because they're not part of my religion and they're not important to me. So I'm able to sort of, stay away from that, and it's not a difficult task. But obviously, when you wear the scarf, you're noticed everywhere. I think the hardest part of being covered in the United States and sort of being out there is just sort of dealing with I walk into a restaurant and people are snickering, or they're talking, or they're whispering, or, you can't. I used to feel a lot more comfortable when I was going to do my prayers to do them wherever I was, because we have times when we do them and you want to complete them. I'm much more cautious now, because I don't know how people are going to react, or whether that's going to get them scared and they're going to call the authorities, or different things like that. So it's things like that I think are more difficult when you're kind of out there with everybody.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. And this would relate to both men and women. How difficult is it to take that prayer time without being looked down upon at your offices or if you're out in public?
Well, I normally, like Salwa, whenever the time for prayer comes, I'll find the most suitable place and I start praying. And like her, since 9/11, particularly a couple of incidents where things were thrown at me, and I am a little bit more cautious. But I would like to go back to the first question that you asked, Zuhair, regarding Europeans and Americans. From my experience, while I have had extremely heartfelt experiences here, but when it comes to prejudice and xenophobia, there seems to be a slight difference between the approach in Europe and approach in America.
Oh, really? How so?
The approach in Europe is very gentle. They smile. The approach here in the United States is very rough. They don't try to hide the xenophobia.
Right.
In Europe, in the United Kingdom, where I spent many years, they smile, but you get the dagger later on in your back. But here, they seem to be unable to control this and construct a nice phrase around it. No,
Right.
you get what you see, extremely rough. So these are the differences between Europeans, at least few Europeans that I have known, not Germans, but the rest. Germans seem to be similar to the Americans in their approach towards Muslim community.
They let you know right where they stand.
Exactly, yes, particularly if you don't speak their language.
See, but I think one of the things I noticed, though, in general in Europe, is you get a much more educated population internationally.
See, that's what my question was. That's I thought that it would be less of an issue in Europe because of the diversity of the people from all over the world in Europe and the diversity in the various countries.
Well, not only that, but then most Europeans have passports. Most Europeans travel for their holidays, travel overseas, so they're not really living in this cocoon that most of us live in here, in a lot of ways. But yet, on the other hand, the fact of the matter is, the intense negative media coverage, because in Europe you have Sky TV, which is similar to our own version of it here, Fox News. You get the xenophobic coverage, and no matter, and I think somebody said back in the 40s, if you say it enough times, it becomes true.
Right.
And I think what everybody has been hearing was, Muslims are terrorists. Islam is terrorism. And then, the whole question of, for example, Turkey's accession to Europe, and one of the biggest sticking issues, and people aren't shy about it, is the fact that Turkey is Muslim. And they're worried about terrorism, even though Europe is full of its own splinter groups of terrorism, like the Italian Red Brigades, like the IRA, like a lot of other European entities. But somehow, terrorism has become the exclusive property and practice of Muslims in the last 6 years. Oddly enough, I should mention, by the way, is that the 1998 State Department report on terrorism actually cited Latin America as the country with the most, where terrorism comes most. But then again, when people don't have the facts, they don't make good decisions, and I don't really fault them for that. In general, like Imam Kazerouni said, you certainly do get a much better treatment, even if they're suspicious of you. They don't make it clear. And the jury's out on that one for me, because I don't know, I'm a direct kind of person. I'd like somebody to say what they're
I almost rather
thinking.
know where you stand,
exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Well, as expected, the phones are lighting up, so let's take a call from Liam on line 5. Liam?
Hello, I have a question. I'm calling from Fort Collins, and we have a fairly large Muslim community up here connected with the university. And it is unfortunate, I believe, that a lot of people have been sort of driven underground or to keep a low profile. I believe part of the reason is because with the Bush administration, they have taken 9/11 as a reason to create a culture of fear to push their agenda. Now, obviously, a very partisan view on that, but that's what I see. And I really do empathize with Muslim communities nationwide, and it's embarrassing to me. However, I do have a question for the guests, and that is, one thing as a Caucasian American, a middle-class American, if you will, I guess, is that it seems that what's been lacking that I'd like to hear from the Muslim community is some outrage over the terrorists. I agree there are terrorists of all different nationalities and in other parts of the world, but what I hear here mostly is complaints about profiling and people enlightening us on the reasons or the motives of the terrorists, which may or may not be valid, but I never hear outrage from the Muslim community that these terrorist acts have been perpetrated on us.
Well, let's hear from our panelists. Is that the case, or are we just not hearing them because it's not what the media covers?
You know, I forgot my I condemn terrorists banner at home. I mean, I don't know what it is that we can do to declare our outrage against terrorism. You know, should we wear shirts saying that? I mean, we've done, I think, everything that we could officially and on the individual level to condemn terrorism, to say that it doesn't represent us. And yet, there might be a question between the transmission and the reception, maybe. But, I think, I guess I want to get to a more basic view here, and that is, as a Muslim, why should I defend myself? I haven't done anything. You know, it's my right to live securely and safely, just as it is for anyone else. I think that Muslims have been a double victim in this country over the 9/11 incident. Some of our people have been killed in the Trade Center, in the World Trade Center, and yet now we actually have to also defend ourselves collectively and say that we're not implicated, or we're not, we'd have to kind of protest our innocence, even though the law actually says that you're innocent until you're proven otherwise. So no, I would disagree with that. I think Muslims all over the world, young and old, big and small, official and unofficial, have declared repeatedly their opposition to terrorism, their opposition to what the terrorists are doing. And I think people have to accept that.
Imam?
Can I, following in what Brother Zuhair said, the biggest travesty after 9/11 is this notion that Muslims are to be blamed because they are Muslim. Somebody claimed allegiance to Islam and committed the most hideous crime. Now the rest of the Muslim community had to defend themselves and their loyalty to be questioned. We never use the same kind of paradigm when we talk about other communities, non-Muslims. In 1995, a veteran, Catholic, blew up a building in...
Federal building.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
160, 170 innocent lives were lost.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ask the entire Catholic population of the United States or the veterans to defend themselves, and did you question their allegiance? Again, a point raised by Brother Zuhair, that we, Imams and others, since 9/11, probably 99.99% of us, we have stood up on on our official capacity and individual capacity, condemn this. The rest of the Muslim world have done that. But because the media does not convey this message, we have people like the caller who says we don't see it.
Right.
And I would like to add one thing else. There is an implicit...
Let me just hang up this call because I think it's echoing. Liam, thank you for your call. Go ahead, sir.
There is an implicit kind of, within the statement, there is an implication that other people stood up to condemn terrorism within other communities. This is the 5th year of war in Iraq. Where are the rest of the American people who stand up and expect this, on the same zeal that they're expecting the Muslim communities to stand up and condemn terrorism, for these people to stand up and condemn what's going on, the genocide that is taking place in Iraq?
I would add that every known Muslim organizations in the United States, CAIR, MAS, ISNA, have repeatedly issued statements condemning the terrorism. But still, again, maybe over 1,000 statements were issued the first year. Mm-hmm. But again, the perception still persists. And again, I want to point out what Imam Ibrahim referred to. My biggest disappointment: where was the condemnation after the scandal of Abu Ghraib? I didn't see moral indignation. I did not see anybody trying to defend Christianity, and the Muslims did not go after Christians, say, where are the Christians who basically perpetrated these hideous acts? In fact, people who joked about it and called it a fraternity prank, they're still high and mighty on the airwaves.
And maybe a piece of that is what Salwa was talking about earlier at the beginning of the show, is the education piece, where you as a Muslim American stood up and not so much in outrage per se, but to educate people, going to schools, going to churches, going to other organizations where you can educate people about what Islam is really about, that it's not about terrorism.
But it goes back also to the point that we cannot hold a whole religion hostage for the few others. Then that goes for Judaism, and there's a plenty of Jewish terrorism that terrorists that are perpetrating hideous acts against Palestinians and unarmed. Also Christians or Sikh or Tamil, Hindus, name it.
Right.
You know, so we cannot hold a religion hostage, a whole religion, for the work of some political agendas or some fanatics.
And maybe because you don't see the outrage doesn't mean that the outrage is
exactly
not there.
Exactly.
Let me ask you about in the past year and a half or so, America's perception, opinion about the war in Iraq has changed from what it was 5 years ago. Has that changed your lives and how people perceive you and treat you and interact with you at all? Zahir?
Not really. I think people's outlook on the war here is not in so much the moral idea behind it. I think it's just a matter of what are we doing there, and is it a profitable venture or not? So I don't think it really has any impact on us, or on me, and at least personally, I can say. I think people are changing their views about the war because it's not going so well, and that's expected when you have a war that doesn't go so well.
Interesting.
In my case, because I took a position right from the beginning, coming from Iraq and knowing the story, the history of Iraq, and my prediction, I'm saying this with all my heart, unfortunately, my prediction came out to be true, because one feels in an awkward position when you predict in such scenarios that lives are being lost for my views to become clear and to be true. I agree with Brother Zuhair regarding the issue. It's the change in attitude is not due to what we call fundamental ethical and moral value or position vis-a-vis the war. It's because the war has become a failure and it is a catastrophe. This is why people are changing their view. Otherwise, still you go around and you see people standing firm on their position that it was right for them to go in. It was right for them to go for regime change. It was totally appropriate and legal, etc., etc. It's not because fundamentally and ethically and morally they stood against violence. It's now, point. Yes, and for me, people come back to me and say, Imam, you were right. Unfortunately, that wouldn't change the reality now in Iraq.
Right. Let's take a call from David. Good evening, David. Thanks for listening and watching.
Hi, I appreciate the call, taking my call. I salute everyone on the panel right now. I think it's great that you guys come forward and talk about these issues. My one question is that when we got attacked by Japan in 1940s, we put people in prison. We haven't done that with the Muslim population in America, and I'm grateful that you guys love this country and all that. I'm just wondering if you had any positive experiences. I know you have a lot of negative experiences, and we've profiled you and all that, and it's kind of hard to get away from that. It's kind of like profiling Mexicans coming across the border, but it's hard, and it will take some time, but I'm sure we'll settle down as far as the Muslim population in America. We're still going to, do our overseas spying and all that. But you have any positive things you can relate to us about non-Muslims that have treated you well or given you advice or said, be safe?
Share your experiences with some.
If I may,
Thank you, David.
I worked in the mosque shortly after 9/11, and I took phone calls as a volunteer. And I must say that, to this day, my heart goes out to all of these people that called in tears. We had attorneys that called and said, you guys' civil rights may be violated. We want to help. Make sure you call us if you have any problems. And that's why I said earlier this country is going to get past this. Unfortunately, it's the negative that sticks, it's the negative that gets covered, it's the negative that gets talked about. But there has been a lot of positive outreach. We had churches calling in and wanting to have volunteers escort women who are wearing the headscarf, so that they may not get hurt. We had a great outpouring of support from people. And unfortunately, that I must admit, that doesn't get talked about often enough. But once again, I would reiterate that where all the squabbles that happen on the level of everyone, the ordinary person, are going to get sorted. But I think the problem that we really need to be looking into seriously is the laws and how they're being applied and how they're being changed. But no, my experience really reflects a lot of positive things that have happened. And on the question of prisons, yes, I'm afraid the Japanese were put in internment camps back in the 40s, but I think some would argue that many Muslims, have been put in virtual prisons. You must understand, we don't live the life that we have lived in the 40s. Now the world is much more complicated. We have email, we have telephones, and I know for a fact that some people's telephones are being bugged. You have to watch over your shoulder where you're going. You're profiled. You're always looked at suspiciously by the government and by some people. And some people would argue that this could very well be a virtual prison. You don't have to put people in a prison nowadays. If you watch every move that they make and interpret it negatively, that's tantamount to putting them in prison.
Selwa, you wanted to add to that?
Personally for me, I am very blessed because I do social work as a living, and by the mere definition, social workers are very open and welcoming. And so, I was very lucky that I work with a great group of people, and they sort of built a shield around me and were willing to help me out with anything that I needed. I think there's a lot of wonderful people out there. And just to say that I think one of the best experiences that I've had is that we did a conference shortly after 9/11, over at DU. There was a panel of about 8 or 10 people, and I will never forget that there was one woman that walked in, and she was clearly upset to be there, even though she had voluntarily bought the ticket to come to the conference and sort of listen to the panel, and made it very clear that she, no matter what was said, she was just not going to come around as far as liking Arab Americans or liking the Muslim population. She was extremely upset, and understandably so. But after listening to the panel, she, at the end, came up and gave us all a hug. There was tears running down her face. She apologized for the reaction that she had had when she came in and said that she had a new perspective and was going to make it a point to go out into the community and speak positively about the Muslim community because she had misunderstood. And so, for me, that's wonderful. It's the best thing that I can think of because, when people share their stories, that's what other people respond to. It's not facts and statistics and, things that sometimes we get really good at sort of quoting from reports and books. And so I think that there's a wonderful population out there. Unfortunately, when you get hit really hard with the negative stuff, sometimes that's what kind of stays.
And the negative
at the
sometimes
forefront.
it can be the platform for some of these positive things to occur.
Exactly.
To create dialogue, yes.
Right.
I mean, as everybody said, we all have had experiences. I remember on the same day, 9/11, I actually went to the center and against the advice given to me by members of the congregation. And I stayed, despite the threat that we're going to blow the center, kill you, etc., etc. I stayed, and every single message that came in that day was negative. And I began, by the end of the day, close to 6 o'clock in the afternoon, I began to wonder what has happened, that people are not seeing the reality. And am I going to go through this repeat the day after and the day after? I was beginning to lose hope. And the last minute, as I was just turning the key and closing my office to come out, there was a call. And I said, oh God, not another swearing kind of message. So I picked up the phone, and I heard a lady crying on the other side. And she said, Imam, I've just watched the interview with you, I think it was Channel 4 or one of the local channels, about the plight of the Muslim community. And the point that really, for a few minutes, I froze. She said that I have just been informed that my son was killed in one of those who was killed in 9/11. But despite that, I have a big house. And if you know of a family that has been mistreated within the community, that the community is not treating them well, I am offering my house for them to come and stay with me.
Wow.
For nearly half an hour, both of us, we were crying on the other side and trying to develop a conversation. And I have repeatedly told the community that there are gems like this around.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, as Brother Zuhair said, when it becomes a legal thing,
right.
when you have somebody like Ghani Bob or somebody in the local area says Muslims have to wear ankle braces and so on. I mean, this kind of thing is the one that sticks out and stands out for the community.
And nobody goes and
Yes.
condemns them.
Yeah.
But
where's the
I
outrage?
thought,
Yes,
where's
where's
the
the
outrage?
outrage?
But one of the things that I was curious about the caller's question is that, well, there is profiling, so what? Well, I'll tell you, so what? It's racist, period.
Right.
And the differentiation, and we have to between the policies and the laws and the politicians and some media personnel who basically sometimes their speech verge and basically incitement. And then that's on one side. The other side would be the community reaction, gems that you heard an example of, that bright stars in surrounding this darkness. One of the positive things that goes also the community level is I have seen, and I got involved in myself in multiple interfaith dialogue, learning about each other. But at the same time, we cannot ignore these sharp increase in hate crimes. Example, just last Friday, not in Colorado, in other states, teenagers they stood outside a mosque spitting on the people coming out after prayer.
Right.
Now, if this was a synagogue, and I have to be frank about it, there would be outrage on a national level. We never heard of even a comment
Right.
about it, except from the newsletter from an Islamic organization about what happened.
Well, and you're raising the point too about profiling. If profiling is okay in one area, then what makes us think that it's not going to be okay on another group of people? Let us take a call from Audrey. Audrey, good evening.
Tamara?
Yes.
Thank you for taking my call.
You bet. Thank you
This
for
is-
listening.
Yes, this is Audrey calling you from Denver, downtown, near Logan. And my point was this. Your earlier caller, Liam, made an important point. But I'm kind of wondering what your panel would say about this. If September 11th, if the bombings would have been committed by another group, a European group linked to terrorism, say like the IRA, what would this country's reaction be in comparison? Just like in comparison to if a synagogue had been bombed, as opposed to a mosque and whatnot. What do you think that reaction would be?
So good question. If it had been another group that we're maybe more comfortable with or more familiar with, would the reaction be the
Well, it
same in a
happened.
nation?
Oklahoma, it happened.
Right.
Well,
Thank you, Audrey.
I think we'd go about it properly. We'd investigate the facts, we'd bring the people that did it behind justice, and we won't go on condemning the whole entire community, which I think is what should have happened in 9/11, but didn't.
And we always seem to look into their history. How were they raised? What's their mental health status? Well, I mean, we find sort of excuses to justify, and yet we don't call it a justification. Now, if any one of us was to try and say, well, let's look at this person's, or as one of the callers said, justifications for why we have, for example, suicide bombers or things like that. And I'm not saying that we advocate that, but if we were to even try to give a justification, it's like, well, you're saying that terrorism is okay. Well, why? Because that person is Muslim or that person is an Arab, as opposed to your average person off of the streets.
Right.
So
Let's make the rules consistent for everyone. is what you're
exactly.
saying.
I mean, I lived in England for over 2 decades. And up to the recent so-called peace talk, the IRA bomb was part of the nature of living in London repeatedly, particularly during from the Conservative parties coming to power in Mrs. Thatcher's case onwards, that in Brighton she nearly lost her life with the entire cabinet. I never saw in England or anywhere in Europe newspaper after newspaper, article after article talking about questioning the loyalty of Irish people who lived as citizens of United Kingdom, whether as in a what we call a secular framework because they were citizens, or as being Catholics, question their loyalty as Catholics. So we already have seen various examples. In Germany, late 1970s, Walter Weinhof, I mean, these terrorist organizations. In Spain, we have the Basque terrorism. In Italy, we had it. Nobody came to say, well, these 6 individuals represent 1.2 million population. Unfortunately, this is being done when it comes to the Muslim community in the United States.
Right. I want to go back to, in dovetailing on what you're saying, Imam. Zahir, you mentioned about the rules. It's one thing when people treat you a certain way in the streets, but when the laws are tailored to possibly target any group. So I want to talk about Homeland Security. Has the new Homeland Security issue sort of targeted more, put a bright spotlight on the mosques in your communities and targeting them as places to sort of look for people and potential suspected terrorists and spies?
Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, I think the whole conduct of the Department of Homeland Security over the past few years has been indicative of a negative profiling against Arabs and Muslims, along with the Department of Justice. A piece of statistics actually I thought was very fascinating that I saw a few months ago, where the Department of Justice is over aggressively using terrorism laws to prosecute non-terrorism cases. And I think the Inspector General found that out of 26 cases that were prosecuted, only 2 were actually properly terrorism related. I think that there's no question there's more aggressive enforcement of immigration, selective immigration rules against Muslims versus non-Muslims. We have an issue now, for example, where Muslims who apply for immigration benefits wait years and years and years before they get an answer, whereas that is not the same case for people from other communities. We have an environment now and a climate where Muslim organizations and Muslim individuals are being repeatedly targeted, being repeatedly harassed, being repeatedly approached by law enforcement and even intimidated by them. We have had also, and we've got a couple of actually precedent-setting instances in the last few years. We have had an American citizen, Jose Padilla, who was taken in for 3 years without being charged, without having any proper legal proceedings brought against him. And it was only until the courts on the highest level intervened that he was actually, tried and convicted. He was convicted. But the process is being violated over and over. The due process, the constitutionally afforded due process is being violated against Muslims. And people are perfectly okay with that because, well, they're the bad guys. And so we need to be careful. That's all right. If we violate the Constitution against these people, we're protecting ourselves. Little do they know. I don't remember who it was that said that, when they came for the communists, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist. And when they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. And now that they came for me, there's no one to say. Exactly.
Yes.
Let's take a call from Susanna. Susanna, good evening.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment about what the Imam said earlier concerning the Catholic who committed the bombing. I don't think that that's a really fair comparison because he didn't do it in the name of Catholicism.
And
whereas in 9/11, these were murders that were committed in the name of Islam. And I think if anyone had done that, being a Catholic and saying it was for Catholicism, the Catholic Church would have spoken out against it. And that's what I think we're asking them to do.
Well, can I actually make a comment on that real quick?
Please.
I mean, when Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic killed well over 200,000 Muslims in Serbia, and they did actually do it in the name of Christianity, let's be very clear about that. I didn't see any Christian churches saying anything about that.
I mean, again, this point here,
But
because
those weren't Americans.
Well, I think we live in a global world.
the idea that if somebody does it because he claims or he doesn't claim that he's doing it on behalf of a faith, then it is justifiable. Or murder has different levels. One is reprehensible because the person is committing it and claiming to represent a particular faith, and the other person does not. I really don't understand the logic behind such a distinction. It's an act when these people committed the crime, they were not waving the banner of Islam in front of them. Neither did McVeigh wave the banner of Christianity or Catholicism. The fact that these individuals were of a particular theological schools is being used as representative of the entire Muslim community in the case of the Muslims. But for the other ones, we tend to justify it that it was not representative of they didn't do it on behalf of Catholicism. I don't think any of these criminals in 9/11 would have said that we represent the entire Muslim community.
Osama bin Laden just a few days ago made the statement that the United States should convert to Islam.
Well, I mean, so these cranks you have here, who was it, the guy that claimed as a Christian minister that the entire world has to be converted to Christianity? We have the cranks within Christianity as well. I mean, what does that mean?
So
they just do it on cable.
Yeah. Suzanne, thank you so much for your call. I'm going to take another call. I think the idea is that if you're an extremist, that doesn't mean you speak for everyone, regardless of whether you're a Christian, Muslim, or Jew, or whatever. Hisham, thank you for calling.
Hi.
Good evening. What's your question tonight?
Just have a simple comment. I think the big problem we see from the media is just the media portray Muslims as terrorists. I don't think they do any research, because in Islam there is nothing that supports terrorism. And in the opposite way, it's condemned terrorism. And one more thing about the media. There are, I think, thousand crimes that happen every single day in the U.S. And the only time we hear about the religion, about murder or criminal, only if he is Muslim.
Hashim, thank you for your call.
That's
Actually, I'd like to comment on this.
Please.
And this is an experience before I even stepped foot in the United States. We're talking now 20 years ago. And this is just to show the powerful images that the media portrays. I came here and just stepping out of the airport, JFK, and I see a group of young black Americans, and I was mortified. I was so scared because every movie, every episode I saw back in Jordan, back in Beirut, was the criminal, the murderer, the rapist was a black male.
Right.
And it goes how global it is. That's the image I had, and just an example how the media can really
shape the reality.
Yes,
or the perception of reality.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. Paula. Let's see. Paula, good evening. Thank you for your call.
Oh, hi. Thank you. I'm glad I got on.
Just have a couple minutes.
Okay. I'm Jewish, and I'm a social worker, too. And I just wanted to comment that I think it would be wonderful if there were a way to foster get-together, something like that, between Jews and Muslims especially, but Christians as well. I have a cousin who lives in Olympia, Washington, and she and other Jewish friends of hers are getting together with Muslims for social events, basically to get to know each other on a personal level and to learn about each other, to get to know each other's friends. And it's respecting diversity, allowing that there are still going to be differences. But I would love to be a part of something like that here in Denver. It's just, I'm so enthusiastic about what's going on here.
And excuse me.
This is the marketing pitch for the Abrahamic Initiative. I mean, there are a number of, Paula, interfaith organizations that are organized specifically for that purpose. And Abrahamic Initiative is one of them, which tries to create a platform where Jews, Christians, Muslims can get together and have conversation and do social work together, interact. And we have programs for what we call breaking breads together. It's not just purely an abstract academic get-together. No, we get together to break bread and learn from each other. So if you are interested, either give me a call or call this St. John's Cathedral and get involved. We'll be delighted to have you on board.
I will definitely do that. I was part of, 1 year after 9/11, I was part of an interfaith rally. They couldn't figure out why they couldn't get rabbi, but it was right at the High Holy Days. But a friend of mine who's a chaplain with the United Church of Christ, said, "Why don't you come?" So it was just wonderful to be part of so many faiths rallying for peace. So I will definitely get on board, and I'm very excited that there's something going on.
I look forward to seeing you, Paula.
Thank you. I look forward to meeting you.
Thank you, Paula. And let's expand on this a little bit more on next steps and where do we go from here. To the gentleman's call earlier about, whether it's a Mexican or a Latino, that I'm going to be concerned and wondering if they're, legally here. If it's a Muslim or Arab-looking person, I'm going to be concerned about, what their motivations are. So how do we get beyond that?
Well, if I can just... I think I think it's incumbent upon each and every one of us, regardless of what our ethnic background is. That's a responsibility that we get by living in a diverse society. I think if we want to do the right thing, it's incumbent upon us to reach out and get to know our neighbors, regardless of where they come from and who they are. If they're African American, if they're Jews, if they're Muslims, if they're Caucasians, whatever. I think that is something that is an initiative that we all have to start within ourselves. And I think once we start there, then I think all the outreach that the Muslim community or the Jewish community or any other community does will then take on shape and meaning. But I think it really starts with us. We all have to want to have the desire to shed our stereotypes and shed our misconceptions and preconceived notions and actually, just for the heck of it, get to meet the other person.
And make life interesting.
Yeah. I would like to add to what Brother Zuhair said, that we are all in the same boat when it comes to fighting terrorism and extremism. But we cannot do it by isolating the Muslim community. Without the Muslim community being there, the so-called extremists will use that as a propaganda that they are being attacked. The only way we could deal with Wahhabism and anything else that feeds in these extremists, when Muslim community and dialogue between the Muslim community and others are established and Muslim communities are on board.
We have to
Otherwise,
start
we
the
would not be
dialogue.
able to
You're
do
right.
it.
Thank you. Speaking of dialogue, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thanks to our panel and you at home for tuning in. Make sure to tune in next week when Stephen Tubbs will take a look at how Platte Canyon High School has healed over the last year. Tune in with me tomorrow morning on Martini on the Rockies at 101.5 FM. For all of us here at Studio 12, I'm Tamara Banks. Good night.